Lando Norris and Piastri have just erupted inside the McLaren garage after discovering new FIA findings from Las Vegas that showed their cars failed the plank inspection by microscopic margins so small that both drivers felt something inside the team had completely betrayed their race. The FIA measured the skid blocks beneath their cars at values below the legal 9mm limit by fractions thinner than a strand of human hair, and these numbers were confirmed through repeated inspections using equipment accurate to 1,000th of a millimeter. When the drivers learned that both cars showed the exact same illegal wear pattern, they confronted the engineering group demanding to know how such a critical failure slipped through the setup process and how this technical collapse wiped out their entire Las Vegas result. And before we dive into the explosive reactions behind closed doors, make sure you subscribe right now, because the story behind this double disqualification is only getting more intense, and the next episodes will reshape the entire 2025 championship. The tension inside the McLaren garage began the moment the FIA released the post-race inspection results confirming that both Norris and Piastri had failed the mandatory plank thickness test. According to the official document, the underside of every Formula One car must always remain at or above 9mm across the defined reference points. When the FIA measured Piastri's car, the values came back at 8.96, 8.74 and 8.90. These numbers were captured using an instrument calibrated to identify differences as small as 1,000th of a millimeter, which meant the readings could not be dismissed as equipment noise or measurement drift. The pressure increased dramatically when the inspectors moved to Norris's car and discovered that his skid block also fell below the 9mm limit. The FIA documented values of 8.88 and 8.93, which again remained stable through every repeated measurement session. With two cars demonstrating the same irregularities, the stewards concluded that the floor wear had not been caused by a unique racing incident, but by a systemic issue rooted directly in the team's setup decisions. That realization hit McLaren hard, because it meant the responsibility for the disqualification rested internally rather than externally. Both drivers had crossed the finish line believing they had delivered exactly what the team needed. Norris drove a controlled race and secured a result that should have strengthened his championship lead. Piastri executed a measured drive under difficult conditions and earned valuable points that kept him within contention. Neither driver expected the post-race inspection to rewrite the entire weekend. However, the FIA's plank regulation does not evaluate driver performance or racecraft. It evaluates a number beneath the chassis. Once that number falls below 9mm, the car is illegal regardless of how clean or controlled the race itself may have been. As the FIA began recalculating the championship standings, the true weight of the penalty became clear. Norris lost the 20 points he had earned on track, dropping him to 390 points when he had expected to leave Las Vegas with a commanding advantage. Piastri lost the points from his strong finish and simultaneously fell back into equal ground with Verstappen. The document makes clear that this was not a mild adjustment. It was a full deletion of both race results. For the drivers, it felt like their season had been reset by a technical oversight that should have been caught long before the cars rolled onto the grid. Inside the team, the engineering staff attempted to explain that unusual conditions during practice had prevented them from gathering reliable data on floor compression. The circuit had seen heavy surface disruption, and interruptions left the team without the long-run reference data they usually rely on to confirm safe ride height margins. But the FIA reminded McLaren that the regulation does not accept environmental or procedural excuses. The legality of the car is determined solely by the final measurement. That constraint created the sense of injustice that spread across the garage and triggered the anger of both drivers, who felt the mistake could and should have been prevented. When Norris and Piastri learned that both cars had produced almost identical measurement failures, they realized that this was not a matter of misfortune but a structural misjudgment in their preparation for the weekend. The discovery that the team had pushed the plank tolerance too close to the edge convinced them that Las Vegas was lost not through racing but through engineering. This is why the loss of points struck with such intensity. It was not only about what they lost. It was about how they lost it. A microscopic error buried beneath the floor of the car had detonated their weekend and shifted the direction of the championship. The core problem emerged when the FIA confirmed that both McLaren cars had failed the plank thickness regulation, and that the failures were not isolated incidents but matched almost perfectly. The rule requires the underside of the car to remain at or above 9mm in the reference zones, and the FIA report showed that Norris's readings fell to 8.88 and 8.93. For Piastri, the numbers were 8.96, 8.74 and 8.90. These measurements were not estimates but precise numerical results obtained with equipment capable of detecting variations that the human eye cannot perceive. The accuracy of these readings removed any possibility of dispute. The drivers understood immediately that such detailed consistency in the measurements pointed toward a structural engineering miscalculation rather than a random event on track. The FIA repeated the inspection several times and each value remained identical, which confirmed that the cars had operated below the legal ride height across the race distance. This eliminated arguments based on chance or external influence. It meant the issue came from the setup chosen before the start of the Grand Prix. For Norris and Piastri, the idea that their weekend collapsed due to a decision made in the garage rather than something that happened during the race intensified their frustration. From the moment McLaren received the document, it became clear that the race itself had not been the cause of the violation. Both drivers had completed their laps without severe off-track moments and without major collisions. Nothing in the race provided a logical explanation for identical plank wear on both cars. This is why the drivers felt blindsided. They believed they had executed their duties correctly only to discover that a foundational element of the car had been pushed beyond its safe limit. The feeling that their work had been undone by an avoidable engineering oversight created a sense of betrayal inside the garage. The situation became even more intense when the team recognized how significant the loss of points would be for the championship. Norris lost 20 points from his second-place finish and Piastri lost the points he had earned with his strong result. The championship standings were immediately rewritten. Norris dropped to 390 points and both Verstappen and Piastri equalized at 366. This meant that what should have been a race that strengthened McLaren's campaign instead became a race that destabilized it. The drivers saw their season turn upside down in a matter of minutes due to a measurement hidden beneath the car. The drivers pressed the engineering team for clarity, and that is where the tension grew even deeper. The engineers explained that disrupted practice sessions left them without the usual data needed to determine safe ride height margins. This meant they entered the race relying on incomplete information about how the chassis would compress under full load on the long straights of the Las Vegas circuit. While this explanation was technically valid, it did not ease the drivers' anger, because Formula One requires precision even in chaotic conditions. To them, the team had gambled on a setup with no margin for error and the gamble had failed. The final layer of the problem came from the FIA's insistence that the plank rule is absolute. The governing body made it clear that no context changes the legality of the measurement. No intent, no accident, no environmental factor. If the plank falls below 9 mm, the car is illegal. Norris and Piastri realized that the team had put them at the mercy of a rule that leaves no flexibility. That understanding is what pushed their frustration to its peak. They had delivered on track. The car had not. And in the world of Formula One, that difference defines entire championships. The engineering crisis inside McLaren became clearer as the team reviewed how the setup for Las Vegas had been chosen. The FIA measurements showed that both cars operated below the legal ride height across the race, which meant the engineering team had underestimated how much the chassis would compress at high speed. The Las Vegas circuit contains some of the longest full throttle zones of the season, and the aerodynamic load generated on these straights forces the floor closer to the tarmac. When this effect is miscalculated even by a fraction of a millimeter, the plank begins to scrape repeatedly. Over a full race distance, these tiny scrapes accumulate into measurable wear. Norris and Piastri understood this immediately, and that knowledge intensified their frustration. One of the key engineering failures came from how little practice data McLaren collected during the weekend. The document notes that the team was affected by disrupted sessions, meaning the engineers lacked the usual long-run information needed to model how the plank would behave under full fuel load. Without this data, McLaren made assumptions about how much clearance the car would retain during the race. In Formula One, assumptions are dangerous because modern floors operate within millimeters of the ground. When the team cannot validate suspension compression, aerodynamic load, and tire deformation with real data, the entire setup becomes vulnerable to small but devastating misjudgments. The FIA readings prove just how unforgiving those misjudgments become when the car leaves the garage. Piastri's plank reached a minimum measurement of 8.74 mm and Norris reached 8.88. These reductions were the result of continuous micro-impacts as the car bottomed out on the straights. Engineers later explained that the cold night temperatures reduced tire pressure and slightly lowered the effective ride height, an effect that grows stronger as the fuel load decreases and the car becomes lighter. But the FIA made it clear none of these factors matter to the regulation. The reading is the reading. If it is under 9 mm, the car is illegal. The drivers grew more upset when they learned that the wear pattern on both cars was nearly identical. This symmetry indicated that the setup error was systemic rather than unique to one chassis. To Norris and Piastri, this meant the team had placed both of them into a race where their results were doomed from the moment the lights went out. The idea that they had driven flawlessly only for the car to fail them because of a technical calculation hit them with the force of a betrayal. It felt as though the engineering group had unintentionally created conditions that sabotaged their own race before it even began, even though the truth was a simple but critical error in preparation. Another engineering factor that angered the drivers was the lack of protective margin around the plank regulation. Experienced teams often build in a safety buffer to ensure that even under extreme compression the plank will remain within legal range. McLaren instead ran a setup that left the car operating extremely close to the minimum limit. With the data gaps caused by disrupted practice, this decision created enormous risk. The FIA report confirmed that once the cars ran at race speed, that buffer proved insufficient and the plank wore down below the threshold. Norris and Piastri interpreted this as the team gambling with a rule that allows no tolerance.